William Schneider. Mr. Schneider is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington and a political analyst for the Los Angeles Times and National Journal. He is the co-author with Seymour Lipsyte of The Confidence Gap, Business, Government, and Labor in the Public Mind. William Schneider.
Thanks very much. As I see it, the topic we have to discuss tonight is it possible to know too much? And is it possible to know too much too early? We're going to be discussing some of the conflicts that have emerged both between media organizations and polls, and to some extent also between polls and political campaigns. You know, everybody assumes that polls have taken all the fun out of politics. We know what happens, as I recall, in the Iowa caucuses this year. One particular network let us know who had won the Iowa caucuses a little bit before the Iowa caucuses got started, which is, I suppose, an advance in the area of scientific polling. Myself, I'm not really a professional pollster, though I deal with polls and, of course, with the media, so I sort of see things on both sides of the fence. I believe in the dictum that was made famous by a great philosopher named Casey Stengel, who said, "I never make predictions, especially about the future." He was right. Polls are not the best devices to make predictions, but they are awfully informative for telling us what happened and why it happened. And I think most people in the news business today would argue that they are an invaluable resource for news gathering and for the covering of elections. We have three very well-qualified speakers who are with us this evening to address the issue. The first is Congressman Al Swift of Washington, who is now in his 6th year in the United States House of Representatives. He has a background in the media as well as politics, I should point out. He was formerly News and Public Affairs Director for KVOS TV in Bellingham, Washington, so he has seen both sides of the picture. He is also the chairman of the House Task Force on Elections, which is a special subcommittee of the House Administration that handles all federal election laws, including laws on campaign contributions. And he's the author of a resolution that passed the House this year that requested the television networks to refrain voluntarily from predicting election returns before the polls close. So he has been actively involved in this issue. Join me in welcoming Congressman Al Swift.
I think it was 7:30 in the evening, about a half an hour before our polls closed in 1980, that I did my first interview about my reaction to Ronald Reagan being declared the winner of the election by NBC. Jimmy Carter had managed to conspire to also muddy the waters by conceding before the polls were closed on the West Coast. The reaction on the West Coast was very strong, very emotional. The stories of people who were standing in line at the polls and heard the news and fled into the night, people who were driving to the polls and heard it on the radio and turned around and went back home and so forth, were frequent and numerous. The networks like to refer to those as anecdotal evidence, and Bill Small, who is an erstwhile president of NBC News, used to be able to work the most marvelous snarl into his use of the word anecdotal. The networks have taken the position, essentially prove that you have done any damage, and what they mean by that is prove that a significant number of people left the polls because of anything we did. In part, that misses. There is some evidence that people did leave the polls, but in part, that's not really the most relevant point. They will argue that the reaction by people was emotional, as though that, by itself, ought to dismiss it as a serious complaint. Clearly, the reaction was emotional. I have sought long and hard to try and come up with a fairly accurate way of describing what I think that emotion was. And words like rape and what have you come to mind. I don't think they're accurate. The closest I've been able to come, if I am accurately reflecting my fellow West Coast people who went through this, is that feeling that you have when you come back to your house or your apartment or your car, as almost all of us have at one time or another, unfortunately, in our history, and have found somebody has been there and they have stolen something. It is a feeling of violation. It is a feeling of outrage that they would dare. It is a strong emotional feeling of deprivation. To Americans, at a time in our society when they are very skeptical, if not cynical, about virtually all our institutions, and most certainly about politicians and government and all the rest, the last straw seems to be that even the process in which they do get a say, the process of going to the polls and making their judgment on what that government should look like, who should be there and how it should be constituted, that even that is now being eroded by people who will tell them that it's all over before they've even had their say, seems to be a profound disruption of their sense of how things should go. Now, I've been told that anyone that is so foolish, so stupid, so emotional, so irresponsible as to think that simply because someone has made a projection somewhere they should not go to the polls is probably someone who is too flighty to be worthy of voting in any event. They certainly are not the kind of solid citizens that we should that we would expect would be voting. And yet it was Ted Koppel, a newsman that I respect, who said before the polls were closed on the West Coast, on the air, there probably is no point in Democrats now going to the polls on the West Coast because it's all over. He was, of course, back on the air in a matter of seconds to correct that and explain that people should go. But my point is that even to experienced observers, experienced reporters, that illogical but reasonable jump that it's all over is one that is naturally made. And if Joe Blow, who is on his way to the polls, hears it's all over and turns around and goes home, I don't think we should be too critical of him if he jumps to that conclusion, if experienced and seasoned reporters jump to the same irrational conclusion. The Congress has tried to deal with this in a number of respects. We first of all recognize that the best way to deal with it is for those who are participating in this kind of function to voluntarily refrain from doing it. There are desperate First Amendment implications of the government taking action that would prevent it. Canada has a law which says that no poll may be published or caused to be published at any time during the election process, let alone on the election eve, and then in Canada, as the time moves across, as the sun moves across, as the polls move across Canada, the CBC and others are able then to report to the news segment of the country, but the results are frozen out, blacked out in the rest of the country. We can't use that model here because we have something called the First Amendment. And no one I know is suggesting that we violate the First Amendment. On the other hand, we are not getting any kind of sympathetic response from the network news managers. I think it's important here to recognize networks are made up of the corporate level administration, who basically have taken no position on it. Then the news division, which has and ought to have some considerable autonomy from the corporate level. And then you have below those network news managers, you have the working journalist, the journeyman newsman, what they call in the profession the street reporter. It is at the news management level that these decisions are made. The street reporter has very little to do with it. As we have worked this issue for the last 4 years, we have picked up increasing support from organizations such as the League of Women Voters and others that are terribly concerned about the deleterious effect of early projections on people's sense of what has happened to their right to vote. We have picked it up from academics, and interestingly enough, we also pick it up from journeyman journalists, not only in the print media, which might be expected perhaps to criticize television coverage because there is a competition that goes on there, but also from journeyman television journalists. They will argue, though usually in private, that what the networks are doing is not reporting news, that Roone Arledge, president of ABC News, when he says we're not in the business of not reporting the news, is begging the question. That a prediction is precisely that, a prediction. So when the network news people say, we have to report this, it is what we are in business for, this is news and we must report it, and to withhold it raises a whole series of ethical and journalistic tradition questions. They will argue, this isn't news, this is making news, this is creating news, this is going out and gathering information from which each network then makes a projection, which is nothing but an extraordinarily accurate guess, but a guess nevertheless, and then goes on the air with it. The networks tell you, no, we don't. We do not use exit polls as the only means by which we project elections. We use those only to verify other information that we have, and we only do it after polls are closed. Well, in my state, at 2 minutes to 8, one network, and I don't know which one, predicted Scoop Jackson had won the last election. Now, it is quite beside the point that that could have been predicted 6 months earlier. It is also, I think, beside the point that it's very hard to build any case that revealing that information 2 minutes before the polls closed in any way significantly harmed the public interest. But don't tell me you don't use exit polls to call elections, because there was no other way to call that one. And in fact, the League of Women Voters and others built a very good case in which the networks, all three of them, consistently didn't follow their own claimed policy in terms of not projecting elections until the polls were closed. What appears to be is we have a situation in which, first of all, government is raising the question, and that raises red flags immediately for the networks, and that's appropriate. Secondly, someone is questioning their judgment, and while the news media makes its profession questioning everybody else's judgment, it does not deal well with people questioning its judgment. And finally, its competitive forces. The competitive forces between the various networks seem, in the network news manager's judgment, to be a more important consideration for them in terms of how they approach this issue than whether or not they are intruding upon the most basic and fundamental right that a citizen of a free society has, namely the right to choose his elected officials, unfettered by this kind of tampering.
Thank you, Congressman Swift. Our second speaker is Roy Wetzel, who will address the issue from a somewhat different perspective, I suspect. He is the general manager of the election unit at NBC News. Mr. Wetzel has been in broadcast news for more than 25 years. He's been with NBC News for 16 years and has been head of the NBC News election unit for 9 years. He informs us that he grew up in that part of the Midwest that's in the Eastern time zone, so he has not only a different occupational perspective, but a different regional perspective from that of Congressman Swift. Roy Wetzel, NBC News.
Thank you, Bill. And I would like to, if I can, try to tell you something about what we do and at the same time respond to some of the things that Representative Swift has said. He has been good enough to tell you a good deal about what our position is, so that will save me a little time. The question of the effect of these reports of election information that we make on an election day is, as he suggests, not perhaps the principal question that we ought to be addressing, but just for the record, there is really no evidence that anyone who really cares about evidence would regard as evidence which demonstrates any effect one way or the other of this kind of reporting. Common sense tells us that if there is an effect, it must be quite a small one, simply because the time at which you're talking about is a time at which I think undisputedly a considerable number of the votes have been cast. And this does not even move to the question of whether or not, in addition to being an effect on whether or not people vote, there could be any impact on how they vote. But the point, I guess, that we make about that is that if there is a tiny effect, suppose you were to suppose that to be the case, which we do not, but suppose you were to accept that, what you're really then suggesting is that millions of people in the United States be deprived of information about something that is of more than passing interest, namely who has been elected President of the United States, for a number of hours, on the odd chance that our reporting that information might cause someone somewhere not to vote. And in weighing those equities, we have come to the conclusion that our duty does lie with reporting. There's another point to be made about turnout, which is often what is talked about in terms of the effect that this reporting of Election Day news on Election Day has. And that is that among people who have registered to vote, a very, very high proportion, approaching 90% in most presidential elections, vote. So that if someone is interested in increasing voter turnout, the trick is to increase voter registration. There are a very substantial number of people in this country who do not register to vote, have not registered to vote, and there seems some reason to believe that if they could be induced to register, they would vote without regard to what election information is reported. I might just say in passing that there has, by the way, been historically in the United States relatively low voter turnout as a proportion of the voting age population throughout the entire history of the country. There was a period during the populist era when turnout rates got higher than they've been at any other time, but during most of our history, getting on now with the present system of government toward 200 years, there have been relatively low turnouts, and the Republic is, at least arguably, in pretty good shape, nonetheless. Then comes the question whether it's a good idea for us to report only news that someone, and in this case the government comes to mind, thinks will either have a good effect or not have a bad effect on people. You'll pardon me for a cliche, I hope, but it's a slippery slope. 15 years ago, Spiro Agnew began criticizing us rather vigorously and kept it up for quite a while, really until he left office in 1973, for reporting upon protest demonstrations against the Vietnam War, saying that such reporting was having a bad effect upon morale in the country and was undermining the ability of the government to carry out the lawfully established foreign policy of the country. That was 10, 15 years ago, and as recently as this week, last week, we've been told that we should not be reporting about the difficulties of the Continental Illinois Bank, because to do so further undermines that bank and indeed undermines public confidence in the entire banking system in the United States. What we do on Election Day is what we do really before Election Day. We report what is going on as best we're able to ascertain that. We go out and we gather a lot of information. Representative Swift has alluded to the fact that Some people feel that some of the information gathering that we engage in is creating news, but really all news that we broadcast is created by us in some sense. We have to go get the information. The only kinds of information that people bring to us are press releases, and by and large, we don't regard those as being a principal source of news. We go out and gather all kinds of information, and that is what we do. And what we do on Election Day is we go out and gather a very large amount of information, some of it through Election Day voter polls, some of it in the form of key precinct vote returns, and some of it simply in terms of gathering the raw vote. But we also, of course, during Election Day gather lots of other kinds of information as well, which we report as part of our election coverage. It really, in our view, would be almost impossible to prevent the news of a presidential election from getting out, even if we were to do as the resolution that Representative Swift has sponsored asks, which we are not inclined to do. But even if we were to do that, we have serious doubts that that would prevent the news from getting out. There's simply too many people who are too interested in it and who have access to too much information. It is conceivable that if we didn't do Election Day voter polls, the parties themselves would do them. And so because they are very anxious in knowing the information. One major point to be made about the Election Day voter polls particularly is that they greatly increase the accuracy of our reporting. And that is one of the things about which we are most concerned. When one starts to report the early raw vote in an election, it can be, it frequently is, indeed I'd go so far as to say that it almost always is very misleading, simply because of the way in which that early raw vote is gathered. An Election Day voter poll, on the other hand, a scientific sample across the entire geographic universe of whatever state or area you're surveying, gives you a much more accurate understanding of what has gone on than early raw vote. So that rather than reporting misleading early raw vote alone, the Election Day voter polls make it possible for us to put that in a much better perspective by accurately reporting what the likely outcome of the election is. And I would, I think, like to stop on the point of accuracy, but by just responding, if I may, to one thing that Bill Schneider said, which has to do with Iowa. We made our projection of the outcome of the Iowa caucuses at 9:19 Eastern Time, 8:19 Iowa time. The caucuses began at 8 o'clock, and at the time that we made our projection, we had received already reports from one of our key precincts, and the News Election Service had transmitted a report of the results of caucuses, which had been concluded. So that I would just like to not let that sit out there, if I may.
Our third speaker is Wilma Goldstein, who will address a somewhat different issue, namely the use of polls in campaigns and the possible potential abuses of polls in campaigns. Ms. Goldstein is a native of Michigan. She has managed local and congressional campaigns as well as issue referenda, and therefore comes at this in a somewhat from a somewhat different perspective from either the professional politician or the news executive. She has worked at Market Opinion Research, which is a Detroit, Michigan polling firm in the United States and in Canada. In the mid-1970s, she came to Washington and worked as the Director of Survey Research for the Republican National Committee and the National Republican Congressional Committee. She's presently associated with the public relations firm of Smith & Haroff and directs the activities of the Campaign Fund for Republican Women. Wilma Goldstein.
Thank you, Bill. Well, in my 10 allotted minutes, I'm going to stay out of this debate about whether or not we ought to have exit polls, because really what I am is an information junkie, And I'm glad they have exit poll information because it adds something to our knowledge about why people did what they did, and it helps us, gives us some things to compare to polling. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about how we use political polls in the election process. Public opinion polling has actually been around for a long time, since about the late 1920s, and as its name implies, they are public documents that are published, like the Gallup poll and the Harris poll and the ones that now most of the networks are doing in conjunction with some of the nation's newspapers and magazines. And basically people are interested in them because they predict the outcome of elections. I'm not going to say in politics that we aren't interested in the fact that we would like to be able to predict the outcome of elections, but we do have some other ways that we use them and other reasons for doing them. There are two basic uses for polling information in politics. One is individual campaigns, and in the last decade, we have seen the parties take on a lot of responsibility for doing polling too, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I thought I really knew when political polling for campaigns started, but then recently reading the obituary of George Gallup, I found out that in Iowa in 1932 he had conducted some polls for his mother-in-law, who was running for the state treasurer of Iowa. Well, I've never had a mother-in-law, so I don't know if that was the great all-time mother-in-law joke or not, or what he was trying to do by that, but then he gave it up and decided to become a political pollster. My awareness of the first time that polling was ever used in a campaign is that it was done for John Kennedy when he was a candidate in 1960 for president, by Lou Harris, who at that time was not a public pollster, but who I think, if I remember listening to him at one time say he had done 245 campaigns in the state of Missouri and liked to think of himself more as a politician. And he built a simulation model in 1960 that he thought would be useful to the Kennedy campaign in telling them what the voters might do in the following situations. And that, to my knowledge, is when it really got started. So it's only been in about the last 25 years that we've had polls that have been used in political campaigns on a regular basis. In 1962, in my home state of Michigan, two gentlemen, one named Walter DeVries, who some of you may have read his book called The Ticket Splitter, and another person called Fred Currier, who was then the president of Market Opinion Research, decided that polling had a place in campaigns and used it for the gubernatorial election of a man named George Romney. And at that time experimented with this concept called ticket splitter, which a lot of academics feel is not a person that's very different from an independent voter, but we had a lot of fun doing it, and Walter got a good book out of it, and we still think ticket splitters are more fun to talk about than independent voters, although we've learned a lot since. We thought we had a prototype then, and we found out that no, we didn't. We had a prototype for an election in the state of Michigan that said that if you read the Detroit News rather than a Detroit Free Press and were a white-collar worker, you had a higher tendency to vote for George Romney, and therefore George Romney knew what to do with his resources. And that's still pretty much the reason that we use political polls. My first experience in them was in 1966. The Republican National Committee decided then to give as a resource to targeted congressional campaigns polling information, or they bought polls and paid for them, and we used them. I was working in a campaign from what I jokingly refer to as a dropout from the Harvard Business School because he decided he wanted to run for Congress rather than write his thesis. His name was Don Regal, and he was an old classmate of mine, came back home to Michigan to run for Congress, and we got this wonderful poll from Market Opinion Research that said on October 1st that we were 20 points behind, and the information that we had in those days was 15 questions crossed in one way, Republican, Democrat, and ticket splitter, which is a far cry from the rather sophisticated 45-minute long polls that we now have that are crossed by about 7,000 different factors. We went on to win that race a month later by 10,000 votes, and somehow I still didn't lose my faith in polls. In fact, I went to work for Market Opinion Research shortly thereafter. And then in '75, as Bill said, I went to Washington to become the director of survey research for the Republican National Committee, which interestingly enough, they wanted somebody there to do that because we were trying to talk more candidates into using surveys as part of their campaigns, and I've often been told that I did that job a little too well, because in the last few years we've had to talk people out of using surveys because they think if one or two are wonderful, why don't we do 6 or 7? But the way we use polls in campaigns is really as a planning tool. It helps us figure out how we're going to use our resources during the course of a campaign, which are never quite as generous as we would like them to be. We learn about the attitudes of the voters, and during the course of a campaign, we go back then and measure progress. We start out by finding out something about the mood of the electorate, and essentially that is to find out whether they're in a positive frame of mind or a negative frame of mind. A positive frame of mind is usually an advantage for an incumbent. A less than positive frame of mind means you're in a good position to challenge. We also try to find out what issues are important and to which segments of the electorate. That's one of the more debatable issues, I think, about polling is, can't they say what they believe? Do they have to have a poll to find out what they think? I think that may be a subject for discussion that you all want to take up later. The other thing, of course, is name identification, and that we know is an important resource in a campaign. If your name identification is 20%, you're probably not going to have a chance of winning. If it's 20% and you know what it is, it helps you decide how you're going to use your money during the course of a campaign, because it takes a long time to build up name ID, and it's an expensive process. If your name ID has gotten up over 70 or 75, you've probably done a pretty good job, and the next poll that you do will measure it and tell you where you are, and it can help you determine then how you're going to use money, time, and other resources during the course of a campaign. The other question, of course, is that wonderful thing called the ballot standing. Are we winning or are we losing? And essentially what you do with a piece of polling information is not so much to find out whether you're winning or losing, but how can you, if you are behind, win, and you use this information to tell you something about issues, name identification, what part of the district or state you're going to go to in order to do this because you need to enhance your image, or if you're an incumbent, how do I stay ahead? Or am I staying ahead, and where am I getting behind, and what am I going to do about all of this? The first poll that is done in an election cycle is called a benchmark. I think that's some sort of marketing term that somebody used because it sounds good and you can sell them. But essentially it's the first piece of research you do, and everything you do thereafter you measure against those results. They're expensive. In today's world, they cost for a congressional district the first time around about anywhere from $12,000 to $15,000. Then there's usually at least one other follow-up poll to see how we're doing after that, that's shorter and less expensive. And then if you think that the race might get close, you do something called tracking, which can be done in a variety of ways. But what I mean, in a very short period of time, you're in the field either every day or once a week for 4 weeks, building about 400 interviews, and I'm talking mostly about congressional districts, building up the information to check change. Particularly near the end of the campaign when everything starts moving quickly, you want to have some sort of measurement. Are my television spots working? Are they turning people on or turning people off? And so you track by doing about maybe 8 or 10 questions and a few demographics to find out how you're doing. Essentially, other uses for them are, they're a good thing, a poll to take to a finance committee and say, like, okay, you guys have been doing a great job raising money for this campaign. We have managed to increase our name identification from 20 to 50 points. We need more money in order to do that, so what you've done up to now has been just great. It would be helpful if we could raise some more money, and then I'd have a better chance of winning. Political action committees and federal campaigns have become used to working with polls, and they are also more used to working with certain well-known pollsters in both political parties, and they add a source of credibility for those candidates who are going after political action committee money. Polling can demonstrate your credibility. I mean, we can all be persuaded by a candidate that we like. I mean, you can see that Congressman Swift has a nice personality. I'm sure nobody in the Democratic Party would turn him down for money. But if he came with a poll that showed how that money might be useful, might get a little bit more out of them, and that's frankly one of the ways that they are used by candidates. Political parties have a somewhat different reason for using survey research. I guess I probably would count a little bit maybe as a pioneer in that too, because when I was at the Congressional Committee, Republican Congressional Committee in 1976, we decided it would be fun to find out why we lost, so we did post-election research, and then also did something called vulnerability research. Today it's big business that both political parties do a lot of national polling as well as the kind of polling that they do for individual candidates on a regular basis. And those kinds of national polls that they do have been important in setting the strategy for the role that the party is going to play in an election cycle. In 1980, the Republican Congressional Committee's polling came up with the theme that was adopted by the Reagan campaign called Vote Republican for a Change. In 1982, a series of polls that were done by the Democratic National Committee and some of their counterparts at their other campaign committees came up with the idea that one of the ways to attack the Republicans in the 1982 cycle was to attack us on fairness. Both of those things had pretty good results, and that we did well in 1980 and the Democrats did well in 82. The other thing that political parties do is, under the federal election law in which we now operate, everything that you do on behalf of a candidate has a price tag on it, including surveys. But when the FEC was trying to set up their guidelines for this, they put together in one room Pat Caddell, Richard Worthland, Bob Teeter, and Peter Hart, who at the time were the four outstanding political pollsters, who came up with this idea that one of the ways that you could assess the value of a poll was that for every day after it had been done, its value actually goes down. So if you can start the polling early enough for a political candidate on the federal level and wait 60 days, you don't have to attribute very many of those costs to the candidate. In fact, it's pretty low. And so that is another thing that parties do with their money, is they do polls for campaigns, and the costs are actually quite low. It usually turns out to be something like $1,000 or $2,000, which is not a whole lot of money. In campaigns, we recommend that they put aside about 10% of their budget for survey research. In today's world, where a typical congressional campaign is about $400,000, that's about $40,000 worth of research, which is not a whole lot because it helps you determine how to use the other $380,000 that you're going to use. Essentially, in political research, we look for trends and shifts and fairly significant kinds of moves, rather than the data that is often looked at and analyzed forever and ever and ever in the academic world. We are essentially interested in whether or not things are moving in our direction or moving away from our direction in major ways rather than small ways. We don't spend a whole lot of time debating about whether anything is pure enough, but we certainly look for standards, and we look for people to do the polling who live up to those standards. We feel that at the congressional level, talking to 400 people is enough to give us good information. It gives you an error level of about 5%, and we can live with that. A statewide poll, if you're running for the United States Senate or the governor, smaller states can get away with 500 interviews, and a place like New York and California usually do about 1,000. And Gallup and Harris and Dick Worthland and Bob Teeter and Peter Hart and Pat Caddell, in polling for the president, can do 1,000, although they seem to be moving up closer to the 2,000 level, and that's because they like to look at regions with greater numbers. And that is essentially what we do with, or how we use political polls during the course of campaigns. And then we add to it the exit polls that Roy does, and we get an idea of whether or not we've been on the right track during the course of the year or not, and we'll see whether or not Al is successful in keeping us from knowing too much about that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I've been asked to make some comments as a concluding speaker and to try to sum up some of the issues and problems that have been raised. It seems to me there are several different kinds of issues raised by the use of political polling. One set of issues has to do with whether polls are accurate, reliable. Another has to do with whether they're meaningful. And the third has to do with whether they are, even if accurate and reliable and meaningful, used in the proper context, or whether they distort or challenge the integrity of the political process. Let me give you an example of each kind of problem. I think the most egregious misuse of polling that I can remember was done by a television network in 1980. It was not Mr. Wetzel's network, but I feel no compunctions about mentioning the name. It was ABC News on the night of the Reagan-Carter debate. One of the worst misuses of polling I've ever seen, in which people were invited during the course of the debate to dial a number and indicate which candidate, Reagan or Carter, they thought had won the debate. Any specialist in the area of polling, survey research, academic or otherwise, will tell you that the worst possible practice is to allow respondents to select themselves, because then you will only get responses from people who choose to give you an answer. Moreover, the time difference meant that it was easier for people on the West Coast to respond because it was early in the evening. People could call as many times as they wanted, and each call cost them 50 cents. Therefore, only people who were prepared to put their money where their opinions were, and many of them were willing to do so repeatedly, were eligible to participate in the polls. There were some quick polls. I'm not sure of their reliability, but some polls were done immediately after the debate showing that among those people who watched the debate, a very critical event, 1 week before the 1980 election, it was virtually a draw. About as many people said Carter had won as Reagan had won. However, during the course of the evening, ABC reported a virtual landslide result in that poll, with Reagan defeating Carter hands down. I think the margin was about 3-1 in that call-in poll. It was not a poll, it was not a survey, it had no accuracy. They claimed it wasn't scientific. It was merely some sort of publicity stunt, which was engineered to get people to watch ABC to find out who had won the debate. However, it had a very profound effect. That is to say, by the next morning it was widely reported in the newspapers, if not on the other networks. ABC touted the results quite strenuously. And by the next day, the tracking polls made it very clear that the common public perception was that Reagan had won the debate. Even among those people who watched, they were simply looking for some sort of signal. And if by 3-1, people who were paying to call into ABC News to express that opinion were for Reagan, then clearly Reagan must have been the obvious winner of that debate. That's a case where polling is inaccurate, misguided, provides misinformation, and significantly distorts the political process. There is another case of more recent vintage, I think, that elaborates, I think, some of the problems that emerge in political polling. In the Democratic Convention this year, we had a rather unusual circumstance. Vice President Mondale named his running mate before the convention. It was unprecedented, a woman. And within a few hours of his naming, the Representative Ferraro as his vice presidential running mate, various organizations, not networks exclusively, including some polling organizations, were out doing polls. They were doing polls asking people how they reacted, how they responded to the situation, and they found that by and large it was a good thing. Everyone thought it was a good idea. But when they asked people what they really thought about Ferraro, did they know anything about her, did they have any opinion of her, favorable or unfavorable, there was still an enormous lack of knowledge because people had only heard the announcement within the past few hours. They were being asked for an opinion where they did not have one. And yet this was being promoted as a kind of accurate assessment on the part of the public, a spot reaction among many people who didn't even hear the news, and some who had heard the news and had no opportunity to evaluate it or to form an opinion. In fact, one of the more interesting results of the convention was to see in the past 2 weeks the response of the incumbent and the administration. They were very alarmed. The Reagan administration was very alarmed by the response to the convention. This year, more than in the past, polls were taken during the convention, before the convention, in the last 2 nights of the convention, asking people how would they vote Reagan, Bush versus Mondale and Ferraro. This, I think, is a case where the poll is, relatively speaking, meaningless because they're asking people to respond to an event, even as it's unfolding, as it's going on. A convention is a week-long television commercial for whichever party is holding the convention. Both the Newsweek poll and the Harris poll showed President Reagan's lead crumbling before the onslaught of the Mondale-Ferraro campaign. They were both taken, of course, during the course of the convention, while there was really a pep rally going on national television. Lynn Nofziger, one of President Reagan's closest political advisors, pointed out that before the Democratic Convention, the Republicans were very complacent. But one look at those polls told them that this election was not going to be a lead pipe cinch. Therefore, President Reagan immediately adjusted his strategy. He abandoned his aloof posture, got the campaign started early, made an early campaign swing through 3 battleground states, questioned the patriotism of the Democratic ticket. They're so far left, they've even left America, he said, in Texas. He felt compelled to abandon his anti-spending principles and call for a $5 billion cost of living increase in Social Security, even though the inflation rate doesn't necessitate such an action. There was a kind of mood of defensiveness and to some extent even a panicky atmosphere in the administration because they looked at those polls. What they did not know was that the party always gets a boost, and that boost is likely to be exaggerated if the poll is taken while the event is going on. But it's always a temporary boost. I've looked at the figures, which came from, for the most part, from the Gallup poll over the last 5 presidential election years, and in every case but one, the party holding a convention, or in every case but 2, the party holding a convention got a boost. The 2 exceptions were the Democrats in 1964. Lyndon Johnson went into the Atlantic City Convention with a 36-point lead over Barry Goldwater. He went out of the convention with a 36-point lead over Barry Goldwater. He was so far in the lead that he had very little improvement that he could make. The only time when a party has actually lost support as the result of a convention was the McGovern Convention for the Democrats in 1972, where support for the Democratic ticket actually went down a point or two after that widely acknowledged disastrous convention. But even in 1968 at the Democratic Convention, which was marred by violence and protest, the Hubert Humphrey Muskie ticket did gain at least a few points at the polls as a result of what is really a week-long television commercial. Sure enough, this week's Gallup poll shows that the effect was temporary, and the Reagan lead has bounced back to a 10-point lead for Reagan and Bush over Mondale and Ferraro. But it was a case where, because there were more polls available, they were available more quickly, they were available before the event had even unfolded, before it had taken place, there was this tendency to jump to conclusions based on information which I think was not inaccurate, but misleading in its implications. It was asking people for opinions that weren't going to last very long in the middle of an unfolding event and under unusual circumstances. The issue that came up this evening, I think, deserves some comment. It's not a case where polls were inaccurate. In fact, the problem with exit polling and the projective use of polls on election day is precisely the opposite. It's not like the ABC poll, that the results were inaccurate, or like the polls taken during the convention, that they may have been accurate but they weren't terribly meaningful. The fact is that the instrument of exit polling has come quite far in past years and currently. And the networks are able to assess the outcome of an election very accurately. It is the accuracy of the polls, in fact, that create the problem. The problem is a conflict between the First Amendment, freedom of the press, and the integrity of the political process. If the polls weren't so accurate, believe me, the networks would not be using them at all to give them what they regard as reliable information for characterizing the outcome of the election. Do they affect voter turnout? Mr. Wetzel indicated that there was no research to indicate that they do. There is a good deal of research in this area. Much of it is not terribly reliable. I can cite one study which was done by political scientist at the University of Michigan, John Jackson. I realize this study has been criticized, but I've read the criticisms. I don't find the criticisms on the whole convincing that his results are inaccurate. He looked at surveys of voters before the election, and then the survey researchers at the University of Michigan actually went out and did a voter validation study in which they looked up on the registration cards in the various localities around the country whether these people had actually turned out to vote. So they didn't simply ask people after the election whether they had voted. They actually looked up on the records to see whether the registrar's office had records that these people had voted. 74% told the interviewers that they had voted. 58% actually had. So they were able to validate the voting turnout of the respondents. Professor Jackson said many people heard projections of the presidential election outcome before the local polls closed, and he concluded they were less likely to vote than people who did not hear the news. By the way, the news was not simply a function of the projections by the national television networks. It was also, of course, in part a function of the early concession speech by then-President Carter, who dismayed many of his fellow Democrats by conceding his defeat quite early, and therefore it was believed endangering the careers of many people on the West Coast. He makes an estimate that hearing the news that Reagan had won from whichever source, either the president himself or the networks, lowered people's probability of voting by 6 points in the East, 9 points in the South, and 12 points in the Midwest and West. Democrats believe that this drop-off cost them a number of close House seats on the West Coast. Al Ullman's seat in Oregon, for instance, he lost by fewer than 4,000 votes. James Corman's district in California went to the Republican candidate Bobby Fiedler by just 752 votes. In fact, however, if you follow Professor Jackson's research, the result is not quite as simple as all that. He found that the election night reporting had more of an impact on Republican turnout than on Democratic turnout. Congressman Swift, I think it was, pointed out that Ted Koppel announced on television he saw no point in Democrats turning out to vote once everyone knew the result because Jimmy Carter had clearly lost. There was an equally strong argument that Republicans had no point in turning out to vote because President Reagan had already won. In fact, that was the most important finding, I thought, in that research. that the drop-off in Republican turnout was actually greater than the drop-off in Democratic turnout. Another way of saying this is that it may have been the case that Republicans felt that there was no point in their coming to the polls because they had little to contribute. Reagan had won. There is a rather commonsensical theory that explains this, what might be a surprising outcome. The theory is that in a presidential election year, turnout is always higher than in a midterm year by about 17 percentage points. A lot of what political scientists call casual voters, marginal voters, come to the polls, the kind of people who can be relied on to vote only once every 4 years. They're less partisan, less ideological, more strongly influenced by the immediate mood of the country. As a result, these kinds of people who are pulled in once every 4 years tend to give greater than average support to the winner, whether the winner is a Democrat or a Republican. The news that it's all over makes the most difference to those kinds of marginal voters, most of whom would have voted for President Reagan in 1980. For instance, his own research shows that the news of who won the election had very little impact on people who were extremely likely to vote. They voted anyway. And it had little impact on those who were very unlikely to vote because they stayed home anyway. It was the marginal voters whose votes tend to go to the winner who are most likely to say, why bother, if they hear that somebody has already won. And so it could well be the case that people like Fiedler and Corman and Ullman would have lost even worse had the news not been projected that the race was all over. I think one instance is sort of informative here. People may also act impulsively. We usually hear the discussion focusing on the behavior of people on the West Coast. I should remind you that there are 2 states, Alaska and Hawaii, that are, for the most part, 5 time zones removed from the East Coast. And in both of those states, if you look at what happened to them in 1980, they had plenty of time to digest the news of who had won the election. It was broadcast in mid-afternoon in both of those states. Carter had conceded quite early. I took a look to see what their voting behavior looked like. Well, it was rather mixed. Turnout was down a bit in Hawaii, up a bit, actually, in Alaska. But what was characteristic of the votes of people in those states was that third-party candidates did unusually well. John Anderson got 11% of the vote in Hawaii, compared with 7% of the vote in the country overall. And that, I think, presumably was from liberal Democrats who said, why not vote for the candidate we really like, now that Carter has already conceded. And in Alaska last time, a very strange thing happened. Ed Clark, who was the candidate of the Libertarian Party, came in third in the presidential election with 12% of the vote. 12%. He beat John Anderson. That was 10 times better than his national performance and 4 times better than his performance in his next best state. If people are convinced that what they do doesn't really matter, I think their inclination is to say, what the hell, and then to vote accordingly. Thank you. We want to turn now to questions for any of our speakers, including myself. I'm asked to advise you that if you have a question, we would like you to use the microphones that are provided. I believe there's one there on either side. There's none in the center. We take these events for radio broadcast, so it is important to us to have the questions heard. At this point, we'd be happy to entertain questions from the floor or comments from any of the speakers who feel compelled to.
I have a question for Congressman Swift, pardon me. Given the reluctance of the networks to exercise self-restraint, and given the obvious impediments to legislating restraint because of the First Amendment, what solutions do you see to this problem?
Unfortunately, it requires a bank shot. I'd like to clarify a point. I don't want to leave the impression that I think exit polls are in any way a bad thing. I think they provide extraordinarily useful information, interesting information for the public, and very useful information to others. But so long as some media are willing to abuse the purpose of exit polls, and that media has an insulation coming from the First Amendment, it puts those who would try to do something about that manifestation in the position of having to shoot at the exit polls as a means of getting at the abuse of the exit polls. This has been done by some states, mine included, trying to interfere with the ways of doing the poll. My next step that I am contemplating would not be to go for legislation, but assuming that the networks pay no heed to either our resolutions, the Senate is considering one now, or substantial expressions of concern from a wide variety of sources across the country, I would look for a voluntary effort to persuade Americans that their votes are private, that they do not need to share that information, and so long as the results of those polls are being used to call the elections before they voted, that they simply refuse to participate, and those refuse to answer the polls. And I would see that taking the form of cooperation between organizations such as League of Women Voters, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Organized Labor, Common Cause, groups that have a long tradition of concern with a broad range of issues and who would like to see the integrity of the electoral process preserved.
Let me ask a question to Roy, because some of you may be aware that precisely this was done by a columnist in Chicago during the Illinois primary this year, Mike Royko, who he's widely read in Chicago. He's now with the Tribune, I guess. He wrote a column in which he told people, do something for the integrity of the voting process, and refuse to answer. He didn't say refuse to answer, he said lie.
Yeah.
Lie to the exit pollsters. Tell them that you're voting for Gary Hart because he's stable and reminds you of your grandfather, and you're voting for Walter Mondale because he's like Michael Jackson, exciting and thrilling, etc. But give them all the wrong reasons and lie to them, so you distort the process. I'm just curious. Roy was there, I'm sure, polling in Illinois. Did anybody notice any kind of impact on the exit polls in Illinois?
The Royko effect that we noticed was that there was a slightly greater tendency on the part of people to decline to participate. I think we tallied it during the day. We were polling actually both Democrats and Republicans in Illinois on that day, unlike most of the primary season, because there was a contested Senate primary in Illinois. So that we polled something in the neighborhood of 6,000 voters in Illinois that day. And I think by count we had 8 people who said to our pollsters that they were declining to participate because of the Royko column. We saw no evidence in the internal data that there had been any effort to mislead us. And obviously, Election Day voter polling is one of the kinds of polling where you find out relatively quickly, within a matter of hours, whether you're in the right general neighborhood, because they count the votes and tell you what the result is, so that you can make a comparison. I would like to, if I may, just comment about something else, and that is that this question of Election Day voter polling and projections, you know, while we feel, as I have suggested, that Election Day voter polling makes it possible for us to do what we do more accurately, and therefore we think better, since accuracy is a very important thing to us. In terms of the presidential election problem that's being discussed here, potential effect on voters in the parts of the country where the polls are still open later than they are in other parts of the country, I really should point out that in 1972, when we had a landslide presidential election, NBC News did not conduct a single Election Day voter poll, and we were still able, at 8:32 that evening, to project the Nixon victory. That is to say, we had projected his victory in a sufficient number of states to produce the requisite number of electoral votes, and that was done entirely on the basis of key precinct vote returns. So that there's a little fuzziness here about this problem, if it is a problem, and I think it's wise to maybe make that distinction.
If I could make a couple of comments in that regard. First of all, Mr. Snyder, what I was proposing was not something quite like the Royko one-shot thing. If a single ad did the job, nobody would buy a second one. I'm envisioning a nationwide, months-long campaign under the auspices of nonprofit organizations that would put a real effort behind it. Second thing that I would point out is that the exit polls are being used increasingly as the main method by which the networks are doing their work. Since we have been raising hell about projections, which is a fairly identifiable, easily defined process, we have found almost all of the networks have, during the primary processes, stopped putting the little square on the screen and putting a check in it and saying, we project. What they do is go on their 6 o'clock news and say, according to our exit polls, Walter Mondale is going to whip the shit out of Gary Hart in the New York primary. They do that 2 hours before the polls are closed in New York. It's very interesting. NBC, ABC, and CBS are joined by the New York Times in the lawsuit in my state to prevent or to overturn the law which tries to interfere with exit polls. But it's very interesting to read the New York Times editorial about how they felt New York was dealt with in the Democratic primary in New York State. They were highly critical of the performance of the networks based upon how they used their exit polls, and they cited as the one that was most irresponsible as NBC.
There's a question over here.
Yeah, I just kind of want to add on to what's been said here a little bit and direct the question, I think, both toward Mr. Wetzel and Ms. Goldstein. If this type of a campaign which the Congressman is describing gets underway, from your vantage points, do you see a rather possibly major problem? In other words, if people either do not answer or lie to pollsters, that it could undermine really basically the whole scientific underpinning of polling with, I think, tremendous impact from both of your standpoints?
I don't really think so, if I can just answer that question first. I mean, they're always part of the error factor in polls allows for the fact that people tend to lie and not really always lie. They have a tendency to answer questions to keep from looking stupid. Mm-hmm. And we know that some of that goes on, and I don't really think it would increase it that much. And it'll be interesting to see how successful a voluntary effort can be. It sounds like a Republican kind of thing to do, Al. No legislation will do it with volunteers.
You occasionally have a good idea.
Congressman, did you have a comment?
No.
Question on the right.
Yes, I'd like to ask if we have some background information on the tradition of presidential abdications, why this is done, say, in the evening or in the dark of the night, rather than after a good night's sleep, say 9 o'clock in the morning after breakfast.
Presidential.
Well, concession speeches. Why aren't they done after polls after everything is?
General presentation. You asked me if you had to type them. I said, no, you don't have to type them if you make them legible. I was too easy on you. Type them if you possibly can. We had to struggle pretty hard with some of the handwriting. You would clearly, the presentation of a lot of memos could have been just visually easier to do. Another element of that, pages torn out of a note with ragged edges just do not, they look sloppy and they just don't give the same impression. I know you say it's cosmetic and you're right, but it makes a difference. Type it, make it as neat as you can. You have to handwrite, make sure it's easy to read. Some of you do have wonderful handwriting, if mine were as good. But that presentation is very important. I hate to say it, I wish I could say all faculty members are totally objective and it doesn't, sloppy edges and difficult writing doesn't make a difference. No, it does make a difference. Do the assignment, think about the assignment carefully and do it completely. addressed one, some of you addressed another. A really good paper really focused on both questions, and that's what, but a lot of people really looked at one and kind of neglected the other. We think a lot about the specific assignments and the wording of them. In that particular assignment, David and I went through about 6 drafts of the wording of that to try to make it as clear as possible. We think about those, and so we want you to think about them as hard and as carefully as we do. And it's going to make a big difference because we've thought about what we're asking you to address. And if you don't address that, if you address something else, even if you do it brilliantly, it's not going to mean nearly as much. Guide the reader through your paper. Don't put in a lot of excess description. Oftentimes, in a number of cases, we've got a lot of description. I knew something about KDDA. Don't put in description. The minister presumably, or your reader presumably, knows a fair amount about the subject at hand in terms of general background. Think carefully about what your reader, whether it's a faculty member or a minister, knows, and don't tell that person what they already know. Don't waste your time, because that's the fastest way to get it thrown aside. If you're talking about a minister. So a minister comes in and says, I know that. It's gone before you get to the bottom of the first page. Same thing with a faculty member. If it's just repeating what we've already talked about, what we've all read, it isn't going to have an impact. Make your points clearly. Don't bury them. There are a number of memos in which there were good points sort of lost in the middle of a paragraph somewhere. You knew what you were trying to get at, but really it was lost in there. Make sure you hear it over and over again, but don't bury your points in there. Let the reader understand your organization. Open with an introduction that says what you're going to do. What's very specifically what you're getting at. And finally, conclude with a summary of your main points. Every time I teach, I'm struck at how many times you have to repeat the same thing. And it's the same thing when I'm out there. It's just important to give a clear guide where you're going, state it clearly, succinctly, without excess material in there, and conclude with a concise summary. A number of memos just stop, made points, and then just stopped. And you kind of think, well, you need a summary on there. It wraps it up, ties the points together, and reiterates them. Now you've got Kevin and Tom that are working with you on these. If you don't understand, if this isn't clear, they're there to reinforce this. Very honestly, these memos need a lot of work. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I'll let you have individual comments. We typed our comments very specifically. I do not like to do what many faculty members do like to do, which is write all over them. We read the case for today. You will get papers back like it. It's a lot easier than writing them separately and typing them. So you'll get, but I thought since I was trying to make the point that you should type yours, that was the least we could do in turn, to type our comments, and my handwriting would not qualify as legible. Sure. specific questions on the comments on your own memo, David or I will be happy to talk to you about them. The case on Kotanaka is what can he do? Let me ask you that question. What can he do? Yes. He's been killing himself. I mean, he's exhausted. How can he make? I mean, he can't make more effort. Can't hear. Okay, what she's saying is you should go and get advice on how to focus his study better. If he works harder, he's depressed and fatigued. That going down that same track isn't going to help. Is that the correct summary? Other comments on what you would do if you found yourself in this situation? Which none of you will. Organize and manage. How's it going to do that? Where are you going to change his priorities? Putting in these enormously long hours.
I think he should take some lessons with Mr. Blight for time management.
Schedule of
time
what's he
management.
going to do? He can't fight Evans is going over to medical school. Come September, probably going to be hard to find. I agree, it's an excellent suggestion. But if you can't find Clyde, what are you going to do?
I think we should be more outward looking because reading the case, it appears that it's become very introspective. He's quite obsessed with his own problems. And of course, in such circumstances, it's quite natural for him to turn. The more he's disturbed, he feels, the more insecure. It's quite understandable that he should turn to his own country. So he has the Japanese people need to turn to his Japanese friends and so on. But I think what he needs is really to get out of his own predicament.
We're going to make sure you can't talk to Shelley. You're not serious.
So we have made a conscious attempt to go our separate ways wherever possible. And I think he should try to open himself up a bit more. It's not a matter of working hard or working even harder or that.
But his paradox is that the more he concentrates on other things, he loses time on his work. And probably the vicious circle will continue.
How do you get out of that? Jim?
Yes. I mean, he needs a confidence. And in
He
order
needs a what?
confidence. And in order to get back the confidence, I agree with Mrs. Nadi that he should concentrate on not all. It seems to me that he's trying to do all that he's supposed to do. But he should focus on a certain thing. He should give the priority on what he's doing. And maybe he forget about the half, and she should concentrate on the half which he thinks has a top priority. If he does that, he may get back the confidence in 2 classes out of 4 classes, and he will see that he can do that.
I think you're exactly right. It's hard to do. Part of it is looking at this situation and saying, like, I need to work on English. The more time I spend on English, the less time I have. And then the reading is taking me longer. The Americans are used to reading English. The Indians who speak English very fluently. How do you know where to set those priorities? How do you say, well, I'll concentrate on 2 courses and let 2 go? If you fail those 2, you're in bad trouble. I agree with you. The priorities are important.
Otherwise, he will fail in 4 classes.
I use it from my experience, like the management class and cultivate his mind that language is nothing. The subject is different from the language. Because I am telling my own experience. I studied in my own language up to GC advanced level, and thereafter I went into a technical college to follow a technical course. And particularly the 2 or 3 Americans have lectured some subjects in factory management and all that. I couldn't get anything, and I left that course within 2 months and joined the government service, public service. Thereafter, I little by little cultivated my mind. Language is different from the subject matter. And thereafter, I concentrate on subjects and go through certain English exams. And ultimately, now I was able to lecture in English, and the students are appreciating. At the starting point, some of my parallel lecturers thought to how this type lecture because his language is poor. But now they are fond of me, and while I am leaving Sri Lanka, the students were very sad that I am leaving because I am because the language is very difficult. Because language is different from the subject. If we are able to exchange our ideas, that if we can cultivate his mind in that line, definitely he will be.
fear of failing, and all the capability to do the program, to get us to your story. I used to like to use the famous phrase of Franklin D. Roosevelt, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. But it is a terrible thing. The other story I'd like to tell you is one of a Mason fellow in Ethiopia a few years back. I saw him in November, and I looked at him, and he was thin, he was pale, he looked horrible. And I said, what is wrong? Are you sick? What is happening? The man looked like death. He said, no, I'm all right. Sure you're not sick? No, I'm not sick. You having a problem with a particular course? No, I'm not having a problem with any course in particular. Why? What's the matter? We talked a little bit. Finally said, I'm tired. Why are you tired? He said, look, I'm an Ethiopian, I'm proud. I want to do really well. I live over here in these dorms at the law school, and I have a room that faces on the inside. He said, I know if I want to do really well, I have to work harder than anybody else. So I have my desk against the window, and every night I stay there and work. I look out the window, and I see if there are any other lights on. Here you can see 3 other dorms around. He said, I stay and I work until all the lights go on. And I said, okay, you don't have to work that hard, but remember, there are people who are afraid of the dark and sleep with their lights on. There are those who go out and spend the night with their girlfriend and forget to turn off the light before they go. Just because the lights are on doesn't mean somebody's working in there. You go back and go to bed at 7 o'clock tonight and go to bed, turn out your light at midnight every night for the next 2 weeks. He came close to getting straight A's after he started getting some sleep. I think if he kept on the way he was going, he probably would have been there. This sense of pride, of concern, are enormously powerful and can be very destructive. People come and think they really have to concentrate totally on their work. And again, I advise these to come in and take 6 courses. Every year. There's one of you in here that will come to me and say, I want to take 6 courses. I guarantee you. And my speech is year after year, I firmly believe you will learn less if you take 6 courses than if you take 4. Because if you take 6 courses, you're going to be so strung out that all you're going to do is read and read and read. You're not going to think about it. You're going to be so busy filling those formal requirements, you're not going to have time to think about what you're doing. You're not going to have time to supplement it by doing other things outside. Set your priorities. I think that's a terribly important thing. There's probably more work than you can do. You've got to think about what you can skim. For example, you've got to think about what's important right now, and what am I going to do, and what am I going to just let go. You need to do it later, or just let it slide. You have to be very hard about what your priorities are before you get into this kind of emotional trap. You have to accept the fact that there's a cultural thing here, that we, as American faculty members, think we're doing you a great favor, but more comments and criticisms are from your people. We're giving you the opportunity to learn. So faculty members will very conscientiously fill up your paper with all sorts of negative comments. I think they're doing a favor. In many ways they are, but you have to understand that that doesn't mean that this is of no value, that it's much to build as you possibly can. So don't overreact to those negative comments. Don't overreact to a low grade. Plenty of people who have gotten C's in their first economics exam got through the course without difficulty. Legally, no, but in terms of surviving, yes. Okay, let's see. There are a lot of elements of the culture of the university which are different from the working environment in which you've been. We tend to be much more open. We tend to be very outstated in terms of evaluation, comment, and criticism. It's much more subtle, although it exists very much in any workplace, in government or any other organization. I gave you that case just because part is a business school case that grows out of somebody's experience. It rang very true with me, my own experience, personally, and it rang very true to what I've seen many, many cases follow through. So I hope you will bear that in mind as you go along. The only other point I would make is if you do feel, expect a difficulty, and don't be surprised and don't be overwhelmed when it happens. Don't be afraid to turn to us. Faculty members, various people who are working with. Don't be afraid or embarrassed if you get a minus or if you get an issue. Yeah. But you're not going to. None of you are. We've all been through this, and it's part of it. It's part of it. Any questions or comments?
I don't know if you know the number of people that commit suicide in the United States. In my profession, that's marginal diplomacy. It's very difficult. The conditions of the possibilities of adaptation to different countries, different cultures. And in this way, even when I never lived in the United States, I have some rules to become to feel myself more comfortable into a place. But the number of suicides from people, principally from Japan, who came to the United States is very high. I don't know if
You said you had some rules. Can you give us a couple of examples?
well, principally, I try to do something that the society not to make some effort to try to build my everyday life. Sports. Sometimes you need to learn several sports to practice one that is useful for the place where you are going to. And I don't know, trying to know people, but it's very difficult, even for the people. American also has a lot of experience working in oil companies, but it's a very difficult problem. Not easy. Because perhaps the environmental problem is more important than just the fact of studying and
Absolutely. Dealing with the whole strange point you made. It's not unique to those of you coming to the United States.